This 1921 barbershop photo looks routine until you see the customer list. This 1921 barbershop photo looks routine until you see the customer list. It seemed like an ordinary portrait at first. A black barber standing proudly beside his chairs, a customer reading the morning paper, the tools of a trade laid out in careful order. Until one detail, scrawled on a ledger hanging on the wall, refused to make sense. Marcus Holloway had spent 11 years working as a collection specialist at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. He had processed thousands of photographs from the Jim Crow era, studio portraits, lynching postcards, labor camp images, church gatherings. He had developed what his colleagues called a clinical eye, the ability to look at the worst of history without flinching. But on a Tuesday morning in October 2019, standing in the climate-controlled archive room, he found himself staring at a single photograph for nearly 20 minutes. The image measured roughly 5 by 7 inches, printed on heavy cardboard stock typical of the period. A black man in his 40s stood at the center of the frame, wearing a crisp white barber's coat over dark trousers. His posture suggested earned confidence. Behind him, 2 barber chairs sat empty, their chrome fixtures catching light from a window just outside the frame. To his right, a second man sat tilted back in one of the chairs, a folded newspaper obscuring his face. The Birmingham Age Herald from the masthead visible above his fingers. Everything about the composition announced respectability. The barber had arranged his space to project professionalism. Scissors and combs lined up on a marble counter. A fresh towel draped over the arm of each chair. A small mirror on the back wall doubled the apparent size of the shop. A calendar from the Carver Insurance Company showed the month of May, 1921. The Memphis Red Sox schedule was tacked beside it, a reminder that Black Birmingham had its own entertainments in an era of segregation. This was a man who understood the visual language of dignity in an era designed to deny it to him. But Marcus kept returning to something on the left edge of the photograph. Partially visible behind the first barber chair, a narrow ledger hung from a nail on the wall. Most viewers would dismiss it as a scheduling book or perhaps a record of accounts. Marcus had almost done the same. Then he noticed the entries. The ledger was open, its pages facing the camera at an angle that made the handwriting barely legible. But with a magnifying loupe pressed to the surface, Marcus could make out a column of initials, not names, initials followed by numbers, RT14, WC22, DM7, JH31. The numbers did not follow any pattern he recognized. They were not dates. They were not prices. They were not appointment times. The word at the top of the visible column, written in a slightly larger hand, was specials. He photographed the image at high resolution and enlarged the ledger section on his computer screen. The handwriting became clearer. Below specials, there were at least 8 entries visible, each following the same format: initials, then a number, then what appeared to be a check mark beside most of them. Something here was wrong. Marcus had built his reputation on what his mentor called productive obsession. Where other archivists might note an anomaly and move on, he would chase it until the photograph surrendered its secrets. His office was cluttered with research files on cases that had taken months to unravel. The identity of an unidentified lynching victim in Tuscaloosa. The location of a burned church that appeared in the background of a 1915 portrait. The true story behind a photograph that a wealthy family had donated with a sanitized caption that contradicted every detail visible in the image. He approached each mystery as if the people in the photographs were waiting for someone to finally tell their story correctly. The barbershop image had arrived as part of a larger donation from the estate of a Birmingham collector who had died without heirs. The collector, Arthur Penny, had been a retired schoolteacher who spent his final decades acquiring photographs of Black Birmingham. 3 boxes of his collection, mostly unlabeled, spanning roughly 1880 to 1940, had sat in the archive's processing queue for 8 months. Marcus was supposed to catalog the items, assign accession numbers, and write brief descriptions for the database. Instead, he found himself unable to move past item 247. He removed the photograph from its archival sleeve and examined the back. A studio stamp in the lower corner read, Childress Portrait. Studio, 4th Avenue North. Beneath it, someone had written in pencil, J. Bledsoe, prop. And then, in different handwriting, darker and more recent, perhaps written by Penny himself when he acquired the photograph, the words, insurance policy. Insurance policy. The phrase nagged at him. In the context of Jim Crow Birmingham, insurance could mean many things. Some of them had nothing to do with fire or theft. He began with the studio. Childress Portrait Studio had operated on 4th Avenue North from 1908 to 1929, according to city directories Marcus pulled from the archive's reference collection. The neighborhood was the heart of Black Birmingham's commercial district, a 4-block stretch of businesses that thrived despite, or perhaps because of, rigid segregation. Black doctors, lawyers, undertakers, and merchants built an economy within an economy, serving a community that white establishments refused to acknowledge. The photographer, William Childress, had been a fixture of that world. His portraits appeared in dozens of families' collections throughout the city. He specialized in documenting success, business owners in front of their shops, graduates in their caps and gowns, wedding parties posed before rented backdrops, fraternal organizations in their formal regalia. His images were aspirational by design, meant to be displayed on mantels and in parlors as proof that dignity survived even in a city that worked daily to deny it. But Marcus could not locate any other photographs from Childress showing a business ledger so prominently visible. In most commercial portraits, the proprietor stood before a carefully curated display of merchandise or equipment with personal records hidden away. This image was different. The ledger had been positioned deliberately. Someone had wanted it in the frame. He turned to the name on the back, J. Bledsoe. City directories from 1920 and 1921 listed a James Bledsoe operating a barber shop at 1614 4th Avenue North, 2 blocks from the Childress studio. The 1920 census filled in additional details. James Bledsoe, 43 years old, born in Alabama, occupation barber, married to Ora Bledsoe, 39, with 3 children living at the same address, a son, Walter, 16, a daughter, May, 13, another son, Charles, 9. The family had been in Birmingham since at least 1910, when the previous census recorded James working as a porter at a downtown hotel. The transition from porter to barbershop proprietor represented a significant climb. By 1920, James Bledsoe had established himself as a business owner in a community where such achievements required more than skill and capital. They required navigation of a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of success. They required protection. Marcus reached out to Dr. Vanessa Cole, a historian at Miles College who specialized in Black economic life under Jim Crow. They met in her office surrounded by books and file boxes, the accumulated research of 2 decades spent documenting how Black communities built wealth under impossible conditions. When Marcus showed her the enlarged image of the ledger, she leaned forward with immediate recognition. "Those numbers," she said, "they're badge numbers." She explained that Birmingham's police department in the 1920s issued badge numbers sequentially, with officers typically receiving numbers between 1 and 50 in any given year. New recruits received the lowest available numbers. The numbers on the ledger, 14, 22, 7, 31, fell exactly within that range. Marcus felt the photograph shift in his understanding. The ledger was not a scheduling book. It was a client list coded by badge number instead of name. Dr. Cole pulled a folder from her desk and spread several documents across the surface. She had been researching what she called the protection economy for 15 years, the system by which Black business owners in Birmingham paid regular fees to police officers in exchange for being allowed to operate without harassment. The payments were not optional. They were not bribes in the conventional sense. They were the cost of opening each morning without being shut down by afternoon. She showed Marcus a letter from 1923, written by a Black grocer named Samuel Patterson to a relative in Chicago. Patterson described monthly visits from officers who expected cash or goods. The visits followed a regular schedule, as predictable as the rent. The amounts varied based on the perceived prosperity of the business. A lunch counter might pay $5 a month. A hotel might pay $50. Miss a payment, and suddenly there were code violations, health inspections, liquor found on premises that had never sold liquor. a fire that broke out conveniently at night. Patterson called it quiet robbery. He wrote that every black businessman in the 4th Avenue district understood the rules, even though nobody ever wrote them down. But barbers, Dr. Cole continued, occupied a special position in this system. Their shops served as gathering places for black men in a way that few other businesses did. Information circulated along with haircuts. A man in a barber chair might discuss the new job he was considering, the meeting at his church, the conversation he had heard at the steel mill, the family member who had just arrived from Mississippi. Police understood that a barber who wanted to stay in business would pay not only in money but in intelligence. And there was something else, something the grocer's letter hinted at, but did not spell out directly. Some officers did not pay for their haircuts at all. They expected the service as part of the arrangement, a regular grooming performed off the books, invisibly, as if the barber's labor belonged to them by right. The photograph began to make a different kind of sense. The customer in the chair, face hidden behind the newspaper, might not have been any ordinary customer. The ledger on the wall might have been positioned deliberately, a visual record of the coercion that made James Bledsoe's business possible and impossible at the same time. Marcus drove to 4th Avenue North on a cold Saturday afternoon in November. The block where Bledsoe's shop had stood was now a parking lot bordered by a bail bondsman's office and a boarded storefront. A historical marker across the street commemorated the 4th Avenue business district as the heart of black Birmingham's commerce from the 1880s through the 1960s. It mentioned the doctors and dentists, the hotels and theaters, the newspapers and insurance companies. It mentioned nothing about the cost of doing business there. He walked the surrounding blocks, photographing the buildings that remained from the era. A few original structures still stood, their second-floor windows blank and dark, their ground-floor storefronts now occupied by check-cashing services and cell phone repair shops. He tried to imagine the street in 1921. The sound of traffic and conversation, the smell of pomade and tobacco, the daily calculation of which dangers could be managed and which could not. A man in his 70s approached him as he photographed the historical marker. The man introduced himself as Roosevelt Jenkins, a retired steelworker who had grown up on the block in the 1950s and 1960s. His grandfather had operated a shoe repair shop 2 doors down from where they stood. "Every business paid," Jenkins said when Marcus explained his research. "My grandfather told me stories. The police would come around like they were collecting rent. If you didn't pay, something bad happened. A fire, an arrest, sometimes a beating in the back of the shop after closing. My grandfather called it the tax." Jenkins described how the system persisted through generations, adapting as the city changed but never quite disappearing. By the 1960s, the payments were less overt, but the expectation remained. Black businesses operated at the pleasure of a police force that viewed them as sources of revenue rather than members of the community to be protected. Dr. Cole had given Marcus the name of another researcher, a retired Birmingham police officer named Theodore Marsh, who had written a self-published history of the department covering its first 100 years. Marcus found his number and called. Marsh was cautious at first. He had spent 30 years on the force before retiring in 2002, rising to the rank of lieutenant before leaving. He understood the complications of discussing departmental history with outsiders. But when Marcus described the photograph in the coded ledger, Marsh's tone shifted. He agreed to meet. They sat in a diner in Homewood, the kind of place where retired cops gathered for morning coffee. Marsh was a white man in his late 60s, heavy-set and direct. He ordered eggs and bacon and listened as Marcus laid out what he had found. Protection fees were common knowledge, Marsh finally said. Nobody talked about it officially. You wouldn't find memos or reports. But every old-timer knew the stories. Black businesses paid to stay open. Some officers made more from fees than from their salaries. It was a system that went back to Reconstruction, maybe before. Marcus asked about the specific practice of officers receiving free services from barbers and other businesses. Marsh was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee slowly. It was worse than fees, he finally said. Some officers treated certain shops like their personal property. They would come in, sit down, get a shave and a haircut, and walk out without a word. Not even a nod. If the barber objected or even hesitated, there would be consequences. An arrest for vagrancy, for loitering, for operating without a license that had been properly obtained. A shop closed for sanitation violations that an inspector invented on the spot. Sometimes worse, sometimes an officer would take personal offense and decide to teach a lesson. He described a practice that older officers had called running a string. An officer would cultivate relationships with several black-owned businesses along his patrol route, usually 4 or 5 establishments that offered goods or services he wanted. Each business would provide those goods or services on demand, without payment, without acknowledgement. A restaurant would feed him. A shoeshine stand would polish his boots. A barber would groom him weekly. A seamstress might mend his uniform. In exchange, the officer would not invent reasons to shut them down or arrest them. But the relationship went beyond free goods. The officers also expected information: who was new in the neighborhood, who was talking about organizing labor at the mills, who might be planning to leave for Chicago or Detroit, who was dissatisfied, who was angry, who was dangerous. The barber chair became an extraction point, a place where conversations could be overheard and reported back to men who viewed the black community as a territory to be managed rather than a population to be served. Marcus returned to the archive and examined the photograph again with this new framework. The ledger labeled Specials was not a list of preferred customers in any ordinary sense. It was a roster of obligations. Each set of initials represented an officer who expected service without payment. The numbers identified them by badge, a code that could be read by anyone who knew what to look for, but would mean nothing to a casual observer or a tax assessor reviewing the business's official books. And the man in the chair, hidden behind his newspaper, might have been one of those officers sitting for his free weekly haircut while the photographer documented the transaction. Or he might have been another customer, a neighbor or friend, positioned to make the scene look ordinary while the real subject of the photograph, the ledger, remained visible but unremarked. But why document it at all? Why would James Bledsoe allow or perhaps arrange for this ledger to appear in his portrait? The risk was substantial. If an officer recognized his badge number and understood what the photograph revealed, the consequences could be severe. Marcus found a partial answer in the estate papers that had accompanied the photograph donation. Among the documents was a legal filing from 1924, a civil complaint by James Bledsoe against the city of Birmingham. The complaint alleged that police officers had extorted money and services from his business over a period of 4 years, beginning in 1920, and that when he attempted to reduce the payments in early 1924, officers had arrested him on fabricated charges of operating a disorderly house. The complaint named no specific officers, referring only to members of the Birmingham Police Department. It demanded $1,000 in damages and a court order prohibiting further extortion. The language was formal and legalistic, but beneath the careful phrases Marcus could hear a man's exhaustion and desperation. The case never went to trial. The complaint was dismissed on procedural grounds, the court record suggested, after a hearing at which Bledsoe's attorney failed to appear. Additional documents hinted that Bledsoe had been pressured to withdraw his allegations by officers who visited his home and spoke with his wife while he was at work. The shop was closed by health inspectors 3 days after the dismissal. It reopened a month later, but the protection payments reportedly doubled. The photograph suddenly made sense as evidence. Bledsoe had commissioned the portrait in 1921, 3 years before the legal complaint, specifically to document the ledger. He had positioned the book carefully, ensuring it was visible but not obviously central to the composition. He had kept the print safe, noting on the back what it represented: insurance policy. He had been trying to protect himself with the only weapon he had available: visual documentation that could prove, if anyone ever believed him, that what he said was true. Darcole connected Marcus with another researcher, Dr. William Spears at Samford University, who had studied Birmingham's legal system during the Jim Crow era. Dr. Spears confirmed that Bledsoe's experience was not unique. Black business owners throughout the city had attempted to use the courts to challenge police extortion and corruption, almost always without success. The legal system was designed to protect the officers, Dr. Spears explained over a Zoom call in December 2019. Judges were white, elected by white voters who saw police as defenders of the social order. Juries were white, drawn from roles that systematically excluded black citizens. Prosecutors were white, dependent on police cooperation for their other cases. A black man accusing a white police officer of theft or extortion faced not just disbelief, but active retaliation from every corner of the system. Most victims understood that silence was the safer choice. The few who spoke up generally regretted it. He showed Marcus court records from similar cases in the 1920s. A black restaurateur named Clarence Monroe, who alleged officers had stolen cash from his register during a health inspection, case dismissed for lack of evidence. A black undertaker named William Redd, who claimed police had demanded payment for each body transported through their precinct, case dismissed when the plaintiff failed to appear for a hearing. A black seamstress named Hattie Lewis, who said officers had taken clothing from her shop without paying, case settled privately on terms that required her to withdraw all allegations and pay the officers' legal fees. In every case, the outcome protected the accused officers and punished the accusers. But Bledsoe had tried anyway, and he had prepared evidence years in advance as if he knew the day would come when he would need proof. Marcus began tracing what happened to James Bledsoe after 1924. The city directories showed him still operating the barber shop in 1925 and 1926. Then his name disappeared from the listings. The 1927 directory showed the address occupied by a new proprietor, a man named Robert Hendricks, who appeared in no previous records. The Bledsoe family was no longer listed at their home address. Death records for Jefferson County in the late 1920s included a James Bledsoe, died November 12, 1927, cause of death recorded as heart failure. He was 50 years old. Marcus could not prove a connection between the failed legal complaint and Bledsoe's death 3 years later. Heart failure was a common cause of death in an era before modern cardiovascular medicine, and black men in Birmingham faced shortened life expectancies from the accumulated stresses of poverty, labor, and racial violence. But the pattern fit what historians had documented about the consequences of challenging white authority in Jim Crow Birmingham. Stress took measurable tolls on black health. Economic retaliation destroyed livelihoods and security. The constant threat of violence aged men before their time. Heart failure could mean many things, and some of them had nothing to do with cholesterol. What Marcus could document was the system that Bledsoe had been forced to navigate. Through police pension records that Dr. Spears had obtained through a public records request filed years earlier, Marcus identified several officers whose badge numbers matched the initials on the ledger. RT-14 corresponded to Robert Tanner, a patrol officer assigned to the 4th Avenue District from 1919 to 1926. WC-22 matched William Caldwell, who served in the same area from 1917 to 1924. DM-7 was Donald McPherson, who joined the department in 1920 and remained until 1935, later promoted to sergeant. The records showed all three men receiving commendations for maintaining order in their patrol zones and developing what the department called cooperative relationships with Negro business owners. What the commendations called cooperation, James Bledsoe had called extortion. What the department considered maintaining order was, from the other side of the barber chair, systematic theft of labor and money from people who had no recourse. Marcus brought his findings to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's curatorial committee in early 2020. The meeting took place in a conference room overlooking Kelly Ingram Park, where the 1963 demonstrations had transformed the civil rights movement with images of fire hoses and police dogs that shocked the nation into action. The irony was not lost on Marcus as he presented a photograph from 40 years earlier, documenting a different kind of confrontation with the same police department, a quieter violence that had never made the national news. The committee included the Institute's director, Dr. Angela Frazier, two senior curators, a representative from the Board of Trustees, and a community liaison officer. Marcus had prepared a detailed report, complete with enlarged sections of the photograph, transcripts of his interviews, copies of the court documents he had discovered, and a demographic analysis showing how many black businesses in the 4th Avenue District had failed or changed hands in the years between 1920 and 1930. The initial response was enthusiasm. The photograph offered a rare, our visual record of economic exploitation under Jim Crow, something that was often discussed in general terms but seldom documented so directly. Dr. Fraser called it exactly the kind of primary source that distinguished serious historical work from generalization. It showed the machinery of oppression operating in real time, and it showed a victim's attempt to document his own exploitation. Then the questions began. The community liaison raised concerns about naming specific officers. Their descendants might still live in the Birmingham area. Some might even be donors to the Institute or connected to current members of the police department. The city had worked hard to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the black community in recent decades. Was it necessary to identify individuals by name, or could the narrative focus on the system itself without pointing fingers at specific families? A senior curator pointed out that the photograph's meaning depended on interpretation. The ledger entries were circumstantial evidence at best. Without direct testimony from Bledsoe himself, without a confession from an officer, without corroborating documents that explicitly linked badge numbers to extortion, they were presenting a theory, not a proven fact. Did the Institute want to make accusations it could not definitively prove in a court of law? The board representative, a retired banker named Calvin Peters, mentioned the upcoming capital campaign. The Institute was seeking to raise $12 million for a new education center, and several potential donors had connections to Birmingham's law enforcement community. A nephew of a current police commander was on the steering committee. Would this exhibit complicate those relationships? Was it worth risking major gifts over a photograph that might be misinterpreted? Marcus listened as the discussion shifted from historical significance to institutional risk. He understood the concerns. He had worked in archives long enough to know that every object carried competing interests. Donors wanted their ancestors celebrated, not exposed. Institutions wanted their missions funded. Communities wanted their histories told, but not always the parts that implicated neighbors and relatives. He had navigated these tensions before. But he also understood what was at stake in this particular case. James Bledsoe had created this photograph specifically to document what was being done to him. He had hung that ledger in plain sight. He had paid a professional photographer to capture it. He had preserved the print and noted on the back exactly what it represented. He had tried to use the courts to challenge the system, and when that failed, he had kept the photograph anyway, as if hoping someone, someday, would look closely enough to understand. 95 years later, the Institute was debating whether to honor that intention or to protect the feelings of people whose grandfathers might have been the extortionists. Dr. Cole attended the meeting as an outside consultant. She spoke toward the end of the discussion, her voice measured but firm, the product of decades of practice in rooms where her research made people uncomfortable. "This photograph is evidence," she said. "It survived because someone wanted it to survive. James Bledsoe took a risk to create it, and someone took a risk to keep it, and we have it now in our hands. Our job is not to decide whether the evidence is convenient. Our job is not to protect the reputations of dead men who abused their power. Our job is to present it accurately and completely and let visitors understand what it reveals about how Jim Crow actually operated." She reminded the committee that the Fourth Avenue Business District was celebrated in historical markers and museum exhibits as a triumph of black enterprise under adversity. Plaques praised the resilience of the community. Tourism brochures touted the heritage of black Birmingham. But resilience against what? Triumph over what obstacles? The photograph answered those questions with specificity. It showed that the obstacles were not abstract or impersonal. They were men with badge numbers who came into your shop every week and expected to be served for free while you smiled. The meeting ended without a final decision. Dr. Fraser asked Marcus to prepare additional documentation and to explore whether any Bledsoe descendants could be located. If the family wanted the photograph displayed and supported the interpretation Marcus had developed, that would carry significant weight with the board. Marcus spent weeks searching. Census records, Social Security death indexes, ancestry databases, obituary archives. Ora Bledsoe had died in Birmingham in 1952, her passing noted in a brief item in the Birmingham World, the black newspaper that had covered the community since 1930. Their 3 children had scattered during the Great Migration, leaving Alabama for cities that promised better lives. Walter, the eldest son, had moved to Chicago in 1943 following a job at a meatpacking plant. He died there in 1978. May married a man named Clarence Harris and settled in Detroit, where she worked as a schoolteacher until her retirement in 1982. She died in 1996. Charles, the youngest, had enlisted in the Army in 1941 and died in France in 1944, his name recorded on a memorial in Washington and in the records of the black soldiers who served in segregated units throughout World War II. Through a combination of genealogical databases, social media searches, and phone calls to strangers who shared the right last names, Marcus finally located a woman named Patricia Bledsoe Harris in Cleveland. She was 78 years old, the granddaughter of James and Ora through May. Her father had been May's son, born in Detroit in 1948, never having known Alabama except through stories. Patricia answered the phone on the third call, cautious about the unfamiliar number, but willing to listen when Marcus explained who he was and why he was reaching out. He described the photograph and what he believed it documented. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. Then she told him what she knew. "My grandmother," she said, meaning May, never talked about Birmingham if she could help it. She said there was nothing there for her anymore after her parents died. But sometimes, when I was a girl and I asked her questions, she would tell me small things. She said her father had been a proud man who built something from nothing and lost it all because he wouldn't stay quiet. She said he tried to tell the truth about what the police were doing to black businesses, and they destroyed him for it. Patricia had never seen the photograph. She asked Marcus to send her a digital copy. When it arrived in her email, she called him back within the hour, her voice thick with emotion. "That's him," she said. "I can see my grandmother's face in the shape of his jaw, the set of his mouth. And that shop." She told me about that shop. She said her father used to let her sweep the floor after school, and he would give her a penny. She said he was the most careful man she ever knew, always watching, always thinking ahead. She gave Marcus permission to display the photograph and to tell her grandfather's story in full, naming the officers, explaining the system, describing the legal complaint and its aftermath. She said she wanted people to understand what kind of courage it took to document your own oppression, knowing that the document might never help you, but hoping it would help someone someday. "My grandfather," she said, "was trying to leave a message for the future. I think you're the one who finally received it." The exhibit opened in February 2021. Time to coincide with Black History Month. The photograph hung in a gallery dedicated to economic life under Jim Crow, surrounded by related documents and contextual panels that explained what visitors were seeing. The ledger section was enlarged and annotated with explanations of the badge number system and the protection economy that pervaded black commerce. Visitors could listen to an audio recording of Dr. Cole explaining the broader patterns of police extortion that her research had documented across the South. James Bledsoe's 1924 legal complaint was displayed in a case beside the image, testament to his failed attempt at official justice and his successful creation of a historical record that outlived him by nearly a century. The exhibit drew controversy, as the board had feared. A columnist for a local newspaper wrote that the Institute was smearing the Birmingham Police Department's historical reputation based on speculation and circumstantial evidence. A retired officer sent a letter to the editor claiming that the interpretation was politically motivated and unfair to the families of officers who could no longer defend themselves. The capital campaign slowed as several potential donors withdrew their pledges or reduced their commitments, citing concerns about the direction of the institution. But the exhibit also drew descendants, families from across the country who had their own stories of Fourth Avenue, their own photographs with unexplained details, their own inherited memories of what it cost to run a business under Jim Crow. A woman from Montgomery brought a portrait of her grandfather's shoe repair shop with a similar ledger visible in the corner that she had always assumed was an accounting book. A man from Selma shared a letter his grandmother had written in 1931 describing monthly visits from officers expecting free meals at her lunch counter. A retired professor from Atlanta presented research showing the police protection fees had been a standard cost of doing business for black enterprises throughout the South, from Reconstruction through the Civil Rights era. Marcus began building a collection of these testimonies, creating a parallel archive of protection economy evidence that expanded far beyond the single photograph he had started with. The pattern repeated across dozens of businesses and multiple decades. The system Bledsoe documented was not an aberration or an outlier. It was the standard operating procedure of Jim Crow commerce, invisible in the official records but remembered in families, buried in legal complaints that went nowhere, occasionally visible in photographs if you knew where to look. Patricia Bledsoe Harris visited the Institute that summer, making the trip from Cleveland with her daughter and 2 grandchildren. She stood before her grandfather's photograph for nearly an hour, sometimes crying quietly, sometimes simply looking, sometimes explaining details to her family members who had never heard the stories before. Afterward, she asked Marcus to walk with her to 4th Avenue. They stood in the parking lot where the barber shop had once been, concrete and painted lines where James Bledsoe had once cut hair and kept his ledger and waited for officers who expected free service. Traffic moved past on the rebuilt street. The historical marker caught afternoon sunlight. He wanted someone to see, Patricia said. He knew they would never believe him in court. He knew they would never punish the officers. He knew the law wasn't meant to protect people like him, but he wanted there to be proof, somewhere, that what happened to him was real. He wanted someone in the future to look at that photograph and understand. She touched the marker commemorating the business district's legacy, running her fingers across the bronze lettering. "They call this place a triumph," she said. And it was. My grandfather and all the others who built businesses here, they created something remarkable. But it was also a crime scene. Every single day they were being robbed, and nobody ever called it theft. The photograph hangs in the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute today. Most visitors pass it quickly, their attention drawn to larger images, to fire hoses and attacked dogs and marches, to the famous photographs that defined a movement. But some stop. They lean close. They read the annotations explaining the ledger. They learn the name James Bledsoe. And perhaps they begin to see every other photograph from that era a little differently. The posed portraits of black success, the carefully arranged images of business owners and professionals standing proud before their enterprises, were not simply celebrations. They were also negotiations. Every black business photographed under Jim Crow existed within a web of coercion that the camera might hide or, in rare cases like this one, might deliberately reveal. The hidden details are everywhere if we know how to look. A ledger on a wall, a hand positioned to conceal something, an expression that does not quite match the occasion, a background object that seems out of place. We inherit these photographs as artifacts of resilience, and they are. But resilience always implies resistance, and resistance always implies something being resisted. James Bledsoe hung his ledger in plain sight. He looked directly at the camera. He knew exactly what he was documenting and what it might cost him. 100 years later, his insurance policy finally paid out, not in legal vindication, not in punished officers, not in compensated heirs. But in this, a room full of strangers looking at his photograph, finally understanding what it cost him to stand in front of that camera and smile. And somewhere, in the silence between the words on the ledger and the eyes that now read them, a message sent across a century arrives at last.